Welcome back to another episode of the Holiness Podcast. My name is Leanne Alexander, and here we're talking about discipleship and holiness and how all that process is so connected. And I'm so excited today to have with us Dr. Robin Johnston, our editor-in-chief of the UPCI.
Well, it's good to be here and talk about what it really means to live life fully as a Christian.
Amen. Amen. We're looking forward to a great conversation. I guess I should probably ask before we get too far into it, for you to share with us a little bit about what it means to be editor-in-chief. I pushed right past that very, very quickly, but I know it means a lot of things. And on a day like today, my sense is, because you've probably been in and out of meetings all day long, tell us a little bit about your day as life as editor-in-chief.
Well, it's this morning was Podcast Tuesday. And we're processing all the podcasts that go out from the building from all the different divisions and ministries in the building, kind of giving them a once over to make sure that they are on point. And then division head meeting, spent the first part of the afternoon talking about exciting policies like building safety and the stuff that, just you get up in the morning to do. You can't hardly wait to get to work to talk about who should handle the fire extinguishers. But that's all part and parcel of what it means to be a leader in the 21st century, I guess.
That's true.
And then just kind of watching sales and what's going on in the division. So a typical kind of busy day at World Headquarters.
Well, we're so glad you're making time today to have this conversation. I talked about you being the editor-in-chief of the UPCI, but I think one of the roles that I think, if I know you, probably matters most to you is the fact that you're a fellow disciple. We're in this journey together. And I think there is a connection between that and this exploration we're having, this season, if you will, of the podcast, talking about this idea of holiness and putting that into some context. And that being said, I really want to start the conversation with a little bit of historical fun. I know how you enjoy history. I would say you're our chief historian, resident historian, whatever the right term is. And of course, the wonderful role you play in the Center for the Study of Oneness Pentecostalism. But maybe I'll even back up even broader than that and just start us with a little bit of the history of how holiness as a doctrine came to us. I think there were a lot of people who maybe just have assumed that's something that we apostolics have cornered the market on. But maybe go ahead and back up and put that into some context.
Yeah, I guess you go to the Old Testament, book Leviticus, Numbers, where God's covenant people, when Israel becomes formed as a nation, God comes down Mount Sinai, gives the Ten Commandments, which is really kind of the basis of what it means to live in covenant with Yahweh. And in some ways, you can look at the Ten Commandments, we call them, really as negative rights, in the sense that, thou shalt not kill implies that there is a right to life. Thou shalt not steal implies that there's a right to own property. And so growing out of those rights and restrictions is this notion of that God's people are a separate people in the sense that, and particularly for Israel, God had called them to kind of be his light to the world. And his means and method, appears from the Old Testament reading, is to reach the world through the example of Israel, that his covenant people would show what it's like to live as God intended us to live. Now, often when you're pursuing holiness, you get hung up in rules, and I won't go into all the details that happens in the Old Testament, but it appears to be more difficult living out than it is on face value. So if you move to the New Testament era, there's one of the, I think, more significant shifts. It happens. There's a lot of influence in the at least second, third century church with Greco-Roman culture, and particularly this idea of splitting apart the soul or the immaterial part of what it means to be human with the material part. That's and a real struggle with the flesh to to understand how that flesh can be holy. And so, you have that struggle of what that means. To live as a Christian in a fallen world, to struggle in a culture that says that material is bad and spiritual is good. So there's that whole struggle at the very beginning of the church age. And then, we're going to jump like Pentecostals do very frequently from the very beginning till, we get the latter part of the second millennium. We have the rise really of what we call the Holiness movement. I think that's probably what you're referring to. And most of that is traced back to John Wesley. He is, intensely hungry to live as a disciple of Christ, to live out what it means to be a Christian. In fact, he and his brother and a few of his friends were at Oxford, living as young Christians, so intent, so hungry to live as what it means to be a good Christian. They did it methodically, and so methodically that people called them Methodists. So that's kind of where the name Methodist comes from. So that was more about the rigor and the discipline that he brought to his pursuit of what it means to live a godly life. But then he senses that while he is probably very disciplined as a person, he may not necessarily be changing his heart. And so the rest of Wesley's life really is consumed with, how do I bring heart change? I can follow rules, I can be methodical, but can I have Christ be formed in me? And from that, from an incident in Aldersgate Street where his heart is strangely warmed, he begins to pursue what sometimes is called Christian perfection, other times it's called holiness. Now, Wesley believed, wrongly I would argue, that after you're saved, you can have the second distinct work of grace, in which the sin nature is removed, root and branch, in this most radical iteration from your life. So Wesley was looking for an experience that would help him to live above sin, so he would never participate in a sin of commission. He might be caught in a sin of omission. He might do something wrong because he didn't know it was wrong. So that's the pursuit of holiness. This idea that, and then again, from that comes ethical behavior, comes living differently because you're trying to live a sinless or a perfect in the sense that you wouldn't commit sins of commission. Now, I'm not sure that Wesley was successful at that. I'm not sure the people who followed him were successful, but there was this intense desire to live a life committed to Christ in everything, of what it meant to be a Christian.
Wouldn't it be nice if that was the way it worked, and we could wave that whatever wand, that's probably the wrong metaphor, and there it goes, root and branch. Not even the desire to.
That would be wonderful. That would be wonderful. And yeah, I wish that were true. But I don't want to sell them short, because there really was this intense hunger to please him and to live a life that was pleasing. And from Wesley, in the Holiness movement, into the African American churches, black churches that are often called the sanctified churches, are churches that are pursuing that same kind of ethical holiness, what it means to live that holiness out. And so when the Pentecostal movement was birthed at the beginning of the 20th century, many of the participants were coming out of the holiness movement. That was probably the principal stream. There are a number of streams that I don't have time. This is probably not the place to go into all of that. But the principal stream of people coming into the Pentecostal movement came out of the holiness movement. And so at Parham, when he's in Topeka, he's looking for an experience beyond sanctification. So he thinks that, he was saved and then he was sanctified. Then he's really looking for what it means to be spirit baptized. And so, he kind of begins to teach spirit baptism. Kind of reinstitutes to the church this idea that being baptized in spirit means that you'll have the Bible sign of speaking in tongues. And it's really that doctrine that forms the Pentecostal movement. We move from there to Azusa Street. Seymour's doing the same kind of thing. He's saying you're saved, you're sanctified, and you're spirit filled. So that's kind of where that holiness part comes. And then, you have not too long into the movement, you have this kind of split over what's called the finished work of Calvary. But both sides of that split are still pursuing holiness, understanding a little bit different, but it means that you're going to live a life set apart. So there's this notion of separation, not just to set apart from, but really set unto. So there's kind of two sides of the coin, trying to set aside the desires of the world, but also pursue them what pleases God. So trying to balance what that means is really what the modern Pentecostal movement grows out of, that sense of we're trying to pursue a holy life.
Very good, very good. And, I think I mentioned in a previous episode on this podcast that holiness it's a biblical concept, obviously. So it's just interesting when you layer over a biblical conversation that historical path, and you talk about some of those essentially evolving doctrines of the church and how they worked out. Mm-hmm. And it does seem like there is that connection to the new birth, because sanctification, you get in this whole fun conversation about when is the blood applied and all this kind of thing. It's all this package deal. There's not a lot of separation of new birth doctrine and sanctification unless I'm...
No. In fact, I think probably we don't place enough emphasis on the baptism of the Spirit as an empowerment to live a holy life. So sometimes we seek the Spirit to be born again, and almost like that's the end all, when really, if we think about what we're saying, we're being born again, so our life should change.
Right.
But it's not just a change of mind and change of heart, although it is both of those. It is this idea that we are filled with the Spirit, and the Spirit empowers us, helps us live an overcoming life. And really what, I talked about streams that came into to form the Pentecostal movement, the principal stream being the holiness stream. There's another stream called the higher life stream. And that really would suggest that Christians would live a higher life. Hannah Whitall Smith wrote a famous, well-read book in the late 1800s. We talked about this, overcoming life. And Pentecostals were looking for the power to live above sin, and that power comes from the Spirit. So it is both changing desires, but also the empowerment of the Spirit. And you're walking away from something, but you're also walking toward something else.
Excellent. Well, in the vein of this conversation, as we're navigating some historical streams, but then also moving into the theology that was developing, let's dive into that theological side for a bit. And I've heard you teach this in different contexts, but God's call to us to be holy. What theologically is happening there? What's He asking of us? Why is He asking that of us?
Like most of the Bible, you have to go back to Genesis 1 through 3 before you can understand the story. You've got to kind of go back and see what it was like in the beginning. And of course, that shouldn't be surprising. Any good book or any good paper that you write has if the opening is done right, then the rest of the work kind of unfolds like it's supposed to. So what you see in Genesis 1 and 2 is the creation of man, formed in the image of God, mankind, both male and female, made in His image. And you have Adam and Eve living in the garden as He intended them to live. So in some ways, a holy life is to try to recreate in our life as much as we possibly can, given the stain of sin or the scar of sin in our life, what it means to live as God intended us to live. So it is not restrictions placed on us because God thought that perhaps you're enjoying this too much and I don't enjoy life, so you can't enjoy life. That's not. It's not this idea that God walks softly and carries a big stick, but He creates us and He makes us for a particular kind of life, how to live life fully. And so, I mentioned that He formed, or alluded to the fact that He formed man from the dust of the earth, and breathed into His nostrils and became a living soul. So you have this notion of being formed by God physically with this dust of the earth, almost metaphorically though, being formed in His image, male and female. And when sin comes, sin really deforms us. So one of the ways to look at what sin does in the life of a human is sin is a deformity. It makes us unnatural. So in some very real ways, I think this is perhaps the beauty of holiness, is that we are then to live in the way that God intended us to live. We're submitting to the Spirit as the Spirit reforms us. And we're born again, so we're reformed then into His image, to a fuller expression of His image as God, to live life as God intended us to live it. So that's the power of holiness. We can talk about how it gets off track, but in its root cause, it's this notion of the God who creates us, who made us, therefore knows how we work. He won't, and then gives us instructions to live in ways that help us to live most fully as a human.
That last part, I've heard you say before, that what God's asking us to do is not arbitrary. It's not like He's playing some kind of game. It's for our benefit.
Right.
And I don't know if you want to elaborate on that, but that's one of the things that I think we can maybe lose perspective. And when we flatten holiness, sometimes we're robbing ourselves of this broader context that God He cares for us, and that's part of the ask to be holy.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can look at it very simply. God insists that we tell the truth. So, and telling the truth sometimes can be difficult, and sometimes we're motivated not to tell the truth because there are consequences for telling the truth. But if you lie, you really just put off the inevitability of the truth, and you got to spin another lie, and you really then build a whole false narrative that at some point someone's going to poke holes in the false narrative, and you're perhaps going to delay the consequences, but the consequences are coming. So God says up front, just tell the truth. Just, deal with the problems that truth brings, and I don't want to take it too much out of context, but in the New Testament says the truth will set you free. And I think we're perhaps talking more generally in the idea that free from the power of sin, but there is a way in which the truth itself sets you free. You don't have to, okay, what did I tell her? What did I say to him? How do I keep the lies all lined up? And then I've watched people, unfortunately, who have lied so often and so frequently that they themselves no longer know the truth. And what a horrible way to live when you can't discern between a falsehood and truth because you've lost, I guess, the filter. I'm not even sure how it happens. I just think I've observed it happening. I think I've known people. And then if you're trying to build a relationship, so if you're, and I probably shouldn't start with lying because it's a most egregious sin almost in my life to deal with people who can't tell the truth. But if you try to build a relationship with somebody who doesn't know how to tell the truth, it becomes impossible. You're building a relationship on a house of cards. So God said, I want you to have good and healthy relationships. You should tell the truth. That is what builds good and healthy relationships. So it's not that God is mean and saying, you should tell the truth. You see, this will cause you less problems in the long run. Your life will be fuller and richer. Your relationships will be deeper and more true because your ability to tell the truth.
Well, that is really a helpful way to look at all of this, because I do think sometimes we've probably flattened the way we approach this, and that's very unfortunate because, as you said, there's the beauty of holiness, and there are so many things about what you just shared about how God's doing this for our own good and some of the things He calls us to. And sadly, sometimes maybe it's just in the way people have interpreted it, but the approach maybe has gotten out of sequence and it's created confusion or maybe a lack of appreciation for it. Talk to us about a right approach, a right framework for this what should be the beauty of holiness.
Yeah, this notion, again, what the Bible calls the beauty of holiness, it's tough for us to grasp because, and I don't know if this is part of the fallen nature of humans or the particular fallen nature of men. but we want to win, and we like to feel like we earn the win. There's something about this idea that if we're playing golf, I'm good enough to win. We can rig the game with handicaps, and we can take foot wedges and gimmies and all that kind of stuff. But in your heart, what you really want to do is be good enough to get up there and walk off without keeping handicaps, and walk off and saying, I won. I at least that's how life works for me. I want to win. I want, and part of that wanting to win is that I want to be good enough. I don't know where it comes from. I don't think my parents grounded into me. I think it's part of the human nature that says I want to be able to earn. So in some ways, grace is the most difficult doctrine in the Bible, because everybody who's saved is saved by grace. Paul makes it very clear in Ephesians, in his letter to the Ephesians. And so you get this idea of grace that says that salvation comes through the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. He takes my sin to the cross and bears the penalty for what I've done. And then, so you got this idea of grace. Well, we resist that just a little bit. We want to, now I've got to earn this somehow. I've got to feel like that there's something that I've done that makes me acceptable. It makes me, I don't want to get to heaven and realize that I didn't have anything to do with me getting to heaven. I want to say, in fact, what I really like to say is, those 4 people over there, they didn't quite cut it, but I did. And so, here's how I did this. I did this. I didn't do that. I did something else. Mm-hmm. So that's part of it. There's this struggle that we have with grace, this almost love-hate. We love grace, but when we think it through real hard, we realize that, I'm getting a free ride here. Mm-hmm. And we talk about getting to heaven by the skin of our teeth. Well, nobody does that, because everybody goes in, if Peter guards the gates, I'm not sure he does. In fact, I'm pretty certain he doesn't. The gates are swung open wide, and everybody goes down the middle, and fanfare, because everybody who gets there by the grace of Jesus Christ. So you've got that idea that work in our life that we have to struggle with. How does that work? And then we've got this notion that it makes sense that if I live certain ways, I can please, maybe earn is what we're struggling with. I can do this and this and this, and we like things to be simple. If we can get a checklist, we like a checklist. And I think that's kind of where we get it astray. And it's not us today going astray, alone. It's what Jesus gets at when he's writing in the Gospels, speaking in the Gospels, and when he's talking to the Pharisees. They were living to and let me use this phrase, this holiness code. And again, there's nothing wrong with codes or directions. We need something to point us in the right direction. We can't find our way home unless someone points us in the right way. So we need to know what that looks like. But so much emphasis on keeping the rules, following the list, and he keeps pointing at their heart and saying, your whitened sepulchres look good on the outside, kept all the rules, but your heart's not changed. So the big concern about it's much more easy to master the outside than it is to do surgery on the heart. Yeah. And so I think it's almost a default. Now, that doesn't mean the outside doesn't matter. Jesus doesn't say to the Pharisees, you should dirty the outside of the sepulcher. What he's trying to get to them is your heart needs to be in this conversation. And the only downside to the white part of the sepulcher is you think you've got it fixed. So you if you follow rules for the sake of rules, you'll convince yourself, particularly if you put your rules beside someone else's rules and your rules are stricter than the person beside you, then you say, okay, you know, I'm doing this, they're doing that. When they hold it all up in eternity, I'll come out better, as opposed to he looks at my heart, and I can fool my neighbor, but can I fool him? So I need my heart. I need surgery on my heart, and that's the big challenge with the holiness piece. That my nature is changed, that my loves are changed, that, you know, that I start wanting what he wants. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the purpose and process of what holiness is, and wholeness, and you know, living abundantly is this idea that my heart begins to want what his heart wants. That's ultimately where we need to be. There's a phrase that shows up in the epistles that we don't talk much about in Pentecostal circles. At least I've not heard it, and it's this notion of union with Christ. What in some ways it means that my heart beats with his heart, that what his desires then become my desires, and that's ultimately what it means to live holy. And it will make a difference in some outward areas of my life, because he knows what's best for me. But it grows out of a changed heart, and it's driven and empowered by not just the heart, but the spirit in my life. And it's, you get this idea of resisting the spirit and then following the spirit, the leading of the spirit. So there's this push-pull that happens in our life sometimes, that to be holy would not be to resist what the Spirit wants, it would be to give into the leading of the Spirit. But there's another layer. You give into the leading of the Spirit, and at the same time the Spirit empowers you. So it's almost like as you go where he leads, you are, and it's not the best word, but you're energized, you're empowered to follow where he leads you, which is an incredible gift of. It's not like he leads you to this impossible place and you've got to make these climbs. At the same time, he's saying, come this way. He's really got his hand out and he's saying, I'm guiding you and directing you.
That's a beautiful metaphor for the Christian journey. You know, one of the things we said with this podcast, and I hope our viewers and listeners have been encouraged by hearing what you've just shared. I really contend that, you know, when we get our focus on following him, that idea of discipleship is the goal.
Right.
When we're focused on that, I'm not suggesting that holiness is an afterthought and it's just some kind of natural, you know, but it really, in the right order, with the right approach and the right perspective, focus on following him. Some of these areas of holiness in our lives, we'll still make intentional, conscious decisions, but once I'm following his leading and he's equipping along the way, some of those things are going to just naturally be part of that discipleship journey.
Yeah, and to get those orders right. When I was a young Christian, someone mentioned a little book by Watchman Nee called Sit, Walk, Stand. Just a small, and it's on the book of Ephesians, and basically says there's 3 movements in the book. The first is to sit, the second is to walk, and the third is to stand. The first 2 I think have more to do with the conversation that we're having today. Nee would say, you know, that we are called to sit with him in heavenly places, and he uses this metaphor. We happen to be sitting in a chair today, so this chair is bearing my weight. I'm not standing on my own, I'm sitting. So I'm invited by God to sit with him in heavenly places. I do it. He offers the chair. He extends the invitation. I'm sitting with him. I haven't earned the right to sit with him. He's invited me to sit with him. And then after I have sat with him, then you get in the middle of the book of Ephesians, chapter 4 starts out, you know, walk therefore worthy of the conversation. So you sit with him, and because you've sat with him, you then can walk worthy of the conversation. That's good King James for you can live your life as one who walks with God. Our natural tendency is to flip that. Is if I walk with him, then ultimately he'll invite me to sit with him. Later in life, when I was in a seminary, I learned this language of that the indicative should come before the imperative. So who I am a Christian, therefore I live this way, as opposed to I live this way and ultimately I can earn the right to be a Christian. That's probably amongst the most free message and makes holiness, it just flips the table on holiness. I do this because of who I am. I don't do this so that I can be somebody.
So needed.
And that, from my life, for who I see myself as a Christian, that was ground breaking for me. Just changed this, and it's not like every day I'm successful at that, because deeply ingrained is this deal: I've got to earn my salvation, and so I've got to remind myself. That's why you pray. That's why you read the Bible. That's why you meditate. That's why you think about these things. You talk about these things, because it's counterintuitive. It shouldn't be in our life, but the messages that we hear from multiple places in our life is, if you're good enough, then you can sit here. And I think ultimately that's why holiness gets this bad name. It sometimes very shallow, because the trap of Phariseeism is just right there. On the other hand, I think some people then just throw the baby out with the bathwater, because being a Pharisee is bad. Therefore, any kind of whitening on the outside of our, push that metaphor a little hard. It's hard to say white sepulcher. He's really pushing hard at that point. But this notion that living ethically and telling the truth and being a good employee and living a morally good life is good. It won't earn salvation, but it's good. So you just have to keep reminding yourself, this is who I am. And when that becomes deeply ingrained, I think it helps us understand who we are. Most people wouldn't have noticed in the last couple of weeks, but outside of World Headquarters here, we put a couple new flagpoles up. And when we purchased this building, there was one flagpole and there was one flag that flew, which was the American flag, because we are located in St. Louis, Missouri, or Greater St. Louis. But decided a couple months ago that since this is really North American church, there should be a Canadian flag. Well, I kind of delight in that flag because I am a Canadian. I don't have to remind myself to be a Canadian. I don't have to get up in the morning and say, think like a Canadian, act like a Canadian, and they'll accept you. That's who I am. And I'm probably obnoxious sometimes, because I remind people I don't really fit real well here, because my allegiance is to another place. My first allegiance is, and my identity. It's not just allegiance. It's really what my identity is. And because I've lived in the United States since 1994, and have thought about, should I, take out citizenship? And this is a great country, and I'm happy to live here. My family's here. My wife is an American. So lots of reasons, but part of me just can't give that identity up, because that's kind of who I am. And what I want about my Christian life to be that same, I want that same kind of deep-seated assurance. This is who I am, and therefore I live this way because that's who I am.
That's so good. When Paul talks about being called to be saints, you're going to live a certain way because of this identity that is your calling. And so that's very helpful, the way you've positioned that.
I'm reminded of years ago. I was in Prince Rupert, British Columbia. It's in another life, pastored a church in BC, and I was up in Prince Rupert for a church dedication. I was at that point what we would call NAM director for the district, and was a home missionary, got his first building, and we were there for a dedication of that building. And the pastor knew that I liked eagles, and Prince Rupert is right on the cusp of Alaska. If you get up, you can see across to Ketchikan, Alaska. The Alaska Panhandle comes down. So, and it's really on an island off the coast. Just go across a bridge. There's a mountain on that island, and he took me. And it was probably June. He took me to the top of that mountain. There was a road up, and actually, when we got to the top, there was some snow, and we kind of pulled up into that snow at the top, and you could look out and see Alaska and the Pacific Ocean. And there was an old kind of dead, as you would can almost picture this old dead twisted tree at the top of the mountain, and out on the edge of that was this bald eagle, and his head, the white head was shining against the back, the blue background of the ocean and off to Alaska. And I was expressing my appreciation. He knew that I liked them, and so he said, "Well, you like eagles? Let me show you some eagles." So when we came down the mountain, just before we came into town, he took a side road, and he took me to the town dump. And at the town dump, there were these majestic eagles sitting all around like ravens or crows, or it was incongruous. They were picking through garbage, just looking for last night's wonton. And when they could have been, I know you're a fisherman. There are lakes up there that probably no one's ever dropped a line in.
Wow.
And those eagles are so adept at diving and catching, but they gave up their identity to become a vulture sitting around someone's waist, living much below what they were designed to be. Wow. So that metaphor speaks to me. That's what I don't want. I mean, that's an easy life for an eagle, but that's not what an eagle's made for. That's not why the wings are powerful. It's not why the claws are sharp. That's not why God created that eagle to be that eagle. And when he created me to be a Christian, he didn't mean for me to live on the edge of the garbage dump. He meant me to live at the mountaintop. And living a whole life, and a holy life, is living on that mountaintop. That's the call that we have.
Wow. Oh, that's incredible. What a picture. I can just picture that. What a good word. Well, I just want to say thank you for sharing that with us and for being on the podcast today. As you're listening, like me, if you were picturing that scene, it's a perfect comparison for what we've been talking about all along, and that's understanding who God's calling us to be and pursuing that. That's going to shape this discipleship journey. That's going to shape some of the choices we make as we pursue holiness and pursue who's calling us to be in that identity. So I hope today this has given you maybe a challenge. I hope some encouragement. I hope some direction. And I hope a challenge. Take some time this week to think about who is God calling you to be. And then how do we address the areas in our lives that we maybe want to tweak a bit as we come to live out this special identity he has for us. So thankful Brother Johnston was here today. So thankful all of you are here today. We pray you have a blessed week. Thank you so much for taking part.